Jon Stewart is pushing for the Senate to pass the Honoring Our Pact Act. If passed, the legislation, which cleared the House in March, would immediately provide health care to post-9/11 veterans exposed to burn pits and other toxins. It would also ensure people exposed to contaminated drinking water at Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base could sue for damages caused by the water.
The contamination at the base began in the 1950s. The CDC reports that as many as 1 million military and civilian staff and their families may have been exposed to tainted water. The Marine Corps discovered the contamination in 1982. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, an extensive list of contaminants were found in the groundwater, surface water, sediment, and soil.
The Department of Veterans Affairs says scientific and medical evidence has shown an association between exposure to contamination, the development of certain diseases, including risks of cancers, adverse birth outcomes, other adverse health effects. Right now, the VA says veterans may be able to receive disability benefits if they served at the base between 1953 and 1987. But North Carolina law prohibits people from taking legal action against polluters if more than 10 years have passed. Joining us now to discuss some of this and the importance of the Honoring Our Pact Act is epidemiologist and emeritus professor of environmental health at Boston University, Dr. Richard Clapp, and we're also joined by Mike Partain, who was born at Camp Lejeune and later diagnosed with breast cancer. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
So, doctor, can you talk to us more about, what are the range of effects, what people experience from the kind of contamination that went on? Maybe give us a little bit more specific detail about what the contamination was and how it affects people.
Well, the contamination, primarily the two most concentrated were trichloroethylene, which is a solvent that's used to degrease metal parts, and perchloroethylene, which is another solvent that's actually a dry cleaning solvent. And both of those have been causes of various cancers. Kidney cancer is the most striking for the case of trichloroethylene, and various other cancers have been related to both of these solvents. There are other contaminants that were in the drinking water, but those are the most predominant. So there have been studies of people exposed to these chemicals around other parts of the world, in Europe especially, and in the US. And that's where this list of diseases that have been linked to these two solvents came from. It's from especially studies in other parts of the world. But there's also been studies of veterans themselves, and Camp Lejeune veterans in particular, that show increased risk of cancer. So all of that was why this list of diseases was created by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry at the CDC, and then, forwarded to the VA for compensation or some kind of listing of compensation eligibility.
Mike, if this contamination has been going on since the 1950s, why has it taken so long for victims to be compensated? And why is there still an ongoing fight about whether or not you can get past this North Carolina law that bars, I assume installs a statute of limitations on environmental claims after 10 years?
Well, when the Department of Justice sided with CTS Corporation, a private polluter in North Carolina, and went to the Supreme Court to obtain their a favorable ruling that basically allows them to dismiss the claims at Camp Lejeune. What that means to dependents such as myself, we would have had to turn in a claim for any damages or any cancers or health conditions by 1995, because the Navy claims that is 10 years after the last action of the polluter, which is what the statute of repose does. In my case, I would have had to turn in a claim for a cancer I did not know I had, for an exposure that I did not know existed 12 years before it all happened.
Yeah, that's unfortunately a common story when we're talking about these kind of environmental lawsuits. It is a built-in kind of systemic issue with the law, where because of these statutes of limitation and the nature of causation being so attenuated and the nature of diseases not maturing for any given period of time, that so many people get caught up in these kind of systemic barriers to getting relief. I'm curious also, how did Jon Stewart get involved in this advocacy, and has it had any effect on your ability to make your claim?
Well, one thing, when you mentioned the statute of limitations and everything, CERCLA does have the Comprehensive Environmental Compensation Liability Act from 1980, does have and addresses a statute of limitations at 2 years from the time that you are aware of your exposure. So in my case, I was diagnosed in 2007. Under CERCLA, I would have had until April 2009 to turn in a claim. The Supreme Court ruling with the statute of repose just, backdates everything to 1995. So what happens is we end up creating you have a second class of citizen because, like, for example, if my father, God forbid, came down with kidney cancer, he would be compensated through the VA. And if my mother or myself were to come down with kidney cancer, the only thing we're entitled to is healthcare as a last resort. If I become disabled, if I die, there's no benefits for my spouse or my family or myself. Whereas my father, because he was a Marine, would be entitled to those benefits through the VA. Now we haven't spoken to Jon Stewart to answer your question directly, but I understand he's involved with the PACT Act, which we are a part of.
Yeah, it's just, the more this is not something people know enough about, this contamination. That I was reading story, pregnant women who lost babies or babies who didn't live very long. There's a stretch of the cemetery in Camp Lejeune known as Baby Heaven, hundreds of babies, infants that didn't make it. Dr. Clapp, can you talk a little bit about the effects on pregnancy from this kind of contamination?
Well, there is scientific literature, scientific studies that demonstrate an increase in stillbirths in women who were exposed during pregnancy and their child was born without life. And that's been seen in other parts of this country, in Massachusetts in particular, in the town called Woburn, Massachusetts. There was an increase in stillbirths in trichloroethylene exposed women. The births from such women, and then also on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, another study of people who were exposed to perchloroethylene in their drinking water also had an increased risk of stillbirths. Another adverse birth outcome is birth defects, children born with a heart defect in particular, and that's been shown, especially in animal studies, that trichloroethylene in particular will cause cardiac defects, heart defects in the offspring of animals that are exposed in a experimental study. So these things are real, and they've been shown in other places and other situations. So that's why I think it's valid that people exposed at Camp Lejeune should, if their offspring had either of these outcomes, obviously stillbirths, they're born dead, but born with birth defects, that's a legitimate claim. It's scientifically backed.
Doctor, you mentioned a couple of these other locations, and I'm sure some listeners will be thinking that this is reminiscent of the stories we've heard in Flint, Michigan. Can you provide just a little more context about how common these incidents of water contamination are across the country for folks who think that it might just be these isolated incidents?
Well, the water contamination with chemicals is widespread. In fact, it depends on whether it's surface water or dug wells, groundwater. But especially for water supplies that are, from groundwater, there's lots of chemical contamination across this country. Another chemical that's been looked at recently is called PFAS, perfluorinated alkyl substances. And that has been found around military bases all across this country. Millions of people, tens of millions of people have been exposed to that drinking water contaminant. And trichloroethylene is found also in groundwater and therefore in drinking water that comes from the ground I don't have the percentage, but a large number of water supplies in this country as well.
Dr. Clapp, Mr. Partain, thank you so much for joining us. This is such an important story, and we appreciate you talking to us about it.
You're very welcome.
We'll have more Rising after this.